You're listening to the Deep End Podcast, a ministry of Hermitage Church, where we have a conversation about Sunday's sermon and chat about ways we can go a little deeper in our faith. I'm Hunter Steinmetz, and I'm one of the pastors here at our church. Every week, we will listen in on a conversation with the preacher from this week about deeper theological pieces of the sermon and suggested practices on how we can embody this word and allow it to seep into our skin. We hope that this podcast will become a part of your weekly faith journey on your drive into work, as you do the dishes, or as you sip your coffee on Tuesday mornings. Thanks for jumping into the deep end with us. Let's listen in on this week's conversation.
Hi, everyone. We are excited to be with you. This is week 3 in our series that we're continuing titled Worship as a Way of Life. I'm Brad.
And I'm Hunter. We're grateful that you have tuned in today. We are looking at Acts 2:42, chapter 2, 42 through 47, and it's that powerful picture of the early church.
Yeah, it's this is one of those passages that feels like a window, kind of like framing a window into something that's really unique, often probably could be overlooked. It's right after Pentecost. We're probably familiar with that. Pentecost is that moment where the Spirit falls on the early church, and this really big moment, towering moment within the life of the church, where the Spirit is poured out, thousands of people come to faith, and now, in this passage, we're getting a glimpse of how they actually lived their lives after Pentecost.
And I think we've talked about this before, but the book of the Acts of the Apostles is kind of like volume 2 to the Gospel of Luke. So Luke writes the book of Acts. So it actually is meant to be read right after the book of, or the Gospel of Luke. But what is surprising is that Luke doesn't give us a list of strategies or dramatic events, but rather he kind of gives us habits and rhythms that shaped their life together. So I will read it for us. This is Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Awe came upon everyone because many wonders and signs were being done by the apostles. All who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to everyone, as anyone had a need. Day by day, as they spent much time together in the temple, they broke bread at home and ate their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having the goodwill of all the people. And day by day, the Lord added to their number those who were being saved.
It's a unique passage. Unique not because of the miracles or the preaching, though that is in Acts 2. But I think the part that can often be overlooked that's unique is simply how simple and communal their lives became. Teaching, prayer, sharing meals, generosity, and joy.
Yeah, and it's not really the kind of church growth strategy that we tend to think about today. It's not about how we set the lights. It's not about all the programs that we could create, or how good of social media presence we have. It's more about devoted people who are living sacred lives in the ordinary together.
Yeah, and the word ordinary is kind of what has been...
Yeah, that's the operating word.
Yeah, moving around in my mind. The church is born in this dramatic, spirit-filled moment at Pentecost at the start of Acts 2. But what happens next is kind of like this really spiritually big moment. And then from that, they don't necessarily go and looking for the next spiritually big moment. They then settle into rhythms, into patterns, into a kind of holy ordinariness.
Yeah. So in a way, the Spirit falls in the fire and in the wind, but then teaches them how to live as if every moment and every space they find themselves in, and then every act of love and attention it actually is sacred.
Yeah, which is a huge shift because worship isn't just about what happens when the Spirit shows up in that big moment, but it's deeply about how we live after the Spirit has come, after we have been awakened, after we've begin to see new. It's learning to wake up, to eat, to gather, to rest, to pray, to play, to work, and to do it all with God in the center of it.
Yeah, and I think even like modern day, we tend to think that worship happens on Sunday, and then we just live the rest of our life throughout the week. But we need to come back to worship on Sunday, where worship is intended to be every part of our life. I mean, when you think of worship, you think of songs, and song is just one of the ways that we worship. I'm not even sure it's the primary way, or shouldn't be, at least. Worship happens in all sorts of forms. And so that's kind of what we mean when we talk about worship as a way of life rather than something that we do. It's who we are. The early church did not just attend worship services. They were worshipers because of how they lived in the ordinary. How they lived their everyday life is what made them worshipers.
And I think that'd be a good place for us to pause and reflect. That's really, really good news for us because most of our lives aren't lived on mountaintops. They're lived in Monday mornings, car rides, messy kitchens, dirty diapers, and long days at work or school. And what if worship could happen in those spaces too?
And I mean, I think in some ways that is the invitation of the passage. The people, they're not waiting for another Pentecost. I mean, maybe they are, but they're not sitting around waiting for that to happen. They were learning to live as if the very presence of God that came to them at Pentecost was in their homes with them, was sitting around tables as they ate, as they gave generously to anyone who was in need. And they weren't just pretending like it was. It actually was. The presence of God was with them in a mighty way.
Yeah, there was a deep connection. There's a word I was thinking of. I was reading something recently from this book called Love's Braided Dance. It's a professor of, the second word might be confusing, but the first word too, theology and ecology. So he studies like earth and, I don't even know all the details.
The environment. Environment.
But he used a word called resonant relationships, and he used the image. I think Matt's used this before in one of his sermons of tuning fork.
Yeah.
Or like when you're tuning an instrument and they come in resonant with one another.
Yeah.
And they align. And it seems like, at least in this context for the early church, they were living in resonance with one another in resonant relationships where things began to be in tune. And my mind went to all of the things that takes me out of resonant relationships with people. Most of the time, that's things that are like technology and social media and all these different things. But this way of life that they lived together shaped them. It changed them. We see words like devoted, together, sincere hearts, all. These words are far more than surface level. They're depth words. There is formation happening with the early church. In a sense, the Spirit is forming a people.
So, maybe a helpful way to frame this is with a question. Like, what were the early church's rhythms, and what might it look like to live into those rhythms today?
Yeah, there's 4 in the passage: teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. We'll start with teaching. This wasn't simply about gaining information, which is, I don't know if it's just a Western idea where we think of teaching as kind of like the transference of information.
Post-Enlightenment, yeah.
But I think it was more about formation, and it was more about being shaped, and it takes time. But it's being shaped by the message of Jesus, by his whole entire life, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, the new creation that happened here. But this deep formation instead of information.
Yeah, and I think in our context, that means intentionally putting ourselves in places where we are learning, like you were saying, not so much just downloading of information, but maybe absorbing information, experience, and allowing ourselves to be formed by that. And in the process of all of that, reminding ourselves who God is and who we are in relationship to that God. That might be a Sunday sermon where it's easy for us to call it worship. It might be a small group. It could be listening to podcasts. It could be reading scripture in community. There's lots of different ways that this can happen.
Yeah. I was thinking too of, like, it's definitely, I think part of it is information. Like, there's,
Sure.
yeah, like information's good. That's good to have. But when I think of time with even mentors that I have, like one thing I remember from those moments with those mentors is not necessarily like what they've told me, but just the presence that they shared with me in that space. And yeah, what they told me is finding its way into my subconscious, you could say. But what's most important is just being present.
Yeah,
with
you
people.
can learn things from what people tell you. You might actually learn more things from what people show you. And if people are willing to spend time with you, sometimes you leave and be like, I can't believe they just gave me an hour of their time. They're so busy. I think they might actually like me. Or if somebody's like, just keeps looking at their watch at coffee, you're like, okay, we'll never do this again.
Yeah.
But the whole time, hey, I love you. Thanks so much for letting me spend this time. And the whole time they're looking at their watch and like looking around, you're being shown, like you're learning more from what you've been shown than what you've actually conversed out loud.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, teaching is so much more than just words, I guess.
Yeah.
But just embodied.
Yeah.
And then I guess from that is fellowship, which is more than just like being together and having fun, although that's part of it too. But the word for it in the Greek is koinonia, which is this deep sense of shared life together. It's that resonant life together, knowing the needs of people, being able to kind of move deeper than just the surface and really move into people's lives and know what people are going through.
Yeah, which is so countercultural to us today. Everything in our world trains us to be independent, and we want that for ourselves. And I think in some ways God desires for us to be independent. But the Spirit leads us into interdependence, which is even transcends independence. Like one of the beauties of being human is that you are independent and you can make your own choices. The problem is your own choices are very rarely ever completely removed from impacting someone else, and so your independence is totally dependent on interdependence, how that functions in community and culture. So I think that even though God does desire for us to be independent and autonomous, the Spirit is also leading us into an interdependence where we carry one another's burdens, we recognize that our decisions affect other people, and where we know people and we allow ourselves to be known.
Yeah. And then the third thing is the breaking of bread, which is both a reference to communion in the early church, so that act, which we would call means of grace, where we somehow experience the presence of Jesus in that moment. But then it also means just sharing meals together, sharing meals in their homes, sitting around tables, probably maybe sitting on the floor in that time period. Worship didn't just happen at the temple. It even happened in breaking bread with people and getting to know them, which makes me even think of culturally how it seems like in a lot of spaces that sitting around a table with people is moving away from a practice in homes, at least too. Like it's so easy to just sit in front of a TV or
warm it up in the microwave and just
it's just a quick thing. Get through it.
But something sacred happens when you eat with people regularly. Jesus is doing it all the time. It gets him in trouble that he's eating with the wrong people. He eats with sinners and tax collectors. What are you doing? Like you are when you put your feet under the table with others, you're saying that you commune with them, that you're approving of their behavior. So what happens under tables is that our relationships build. And this is what Jesus is trying to inform in us, that eating with people builds trust and opens space for honesty, and people begin to be known and allow themselves to be known and also to know others. And you see people for who they really are, not just when they wear their Sunday best and you say, hi, how are you? And you don't really mean it. You just, I'm so glad. Okay, see ya. See you next Sunday.
Yeah.
But you actually see people for who they are.
Yeah. And then from that is in the text is prayer. Didn't just happen alone, but they prayed together. Prayer wasn't simply a kind of private act, although it is that as well, but it was this deeply shared language of dependence and hope. So, yeah.
Yeah. So if you put all of that together, learning, sharing life, eating together, breaking bread, and praying, that's not some sort of like church growth program, right? It's a way of life. It's a pattern of worship, and this is how they're doing it in the very beginning of the church.
Yeah, and the result of that is that, and it might not be linear, but at least what happened in the text is that everyone was filled with awe. Everyone was filled with, well, the word could be translated to reverence, or I think the original word is fear, but reverence before a God who is so other, a God who is so different than the patterns of the world. And that the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. And it's not just about numbers, but it's about the kind of life that's rich and beautiful, and from that people are drawn to.
So let's land this plane practically. If you're listening and you're wondering, how do I even start living worship as a way of life in the ordinary? I think the answer to that is you can start small. This doesn't have to be some large, wild thing that is unattainable. I think some questions, like introspective questions that you can ask yourself, are things like, who do I break bread with regularly? And you don't have to think communion. Just think meals. Like, who is it that you are sharing meals with regularly? Where are you being taught and shaped in the way of Jesus? And even kind of as we talked in the beginning, that it may not be information download. It may be like, what are different ways that you are being, that you are allowing yourself to be in spaces where you can even be formed by learning? Who are the people who actually know you, like really deeply? They know the things that you're afraid of. And who is it that you know? And maybe they're not your spouse or your family. Who are the people outside of that circle? And then finally, when it comes to the prayer piece, where do you make space to pray? I know even for me, lots of times when I'm driving, I use that time just to pray. I don't get on my knees and close my eyes. That is a terrible decision while driving. But I just act like Jesus is sitting in the passenger seat with me, and I talk to him, out loud, and there's no issue with that. And that's how I make space to pray. So,
yeah, and here's the encouragement, I guess, from this. This doesn't have to be dramatic. It doesn't have to be the start of Acts 2. You don't need to launch a new ministry or write a spiritual rule of life, although those might be things that the Lord is leading you to. Maybe it starts by inviting someone over for dinner this week. Maybe it's even saying, I want to invite someone over for dinner this week, and maybe we're going to all cook the meal together. Or maybe it's praying out loud with a friend, or like Hunter shared, which is such a beautiful image of like praying in the car and acting like Jesus, imagining Jesus is right there next to you when you're talking.
I believe that we believe that he actually is there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
wearing a seatbelt.
Or it's reading scripture before you check your phone in the morning. I heard this week. So I think there's something that's like the first thing you hear when you go to sleep, or what you take in, or when you wake up is the most important thing to start your day. It's kind of like it moves you into the rest of your day. And it kind of allows you to tune your heart to Jesus.
Yeah, it's like breakfast is the most important meal of the day, but that's the physical.
Yeah.
Like we think about those things, but even mentally, emotionally, spiritually, what is the things that you're eating the very first thing in the morning? Because it's the most important thing that you're going to put in your body, and how are you doing that? I think that the Spirit isn't asking us to chase the next big thing. I don't think the Spirit is like, look for Pentecost so that you can be blown out on the streets. In a kind of backwards way, I think the Spirit is inviting us to live worship in the ordinary and to live faithfully and beautifully just in the mundane, the everyday, and to trust that God is deeply at work there. God doesn't live just on Mount Sinai. He lives in the valley where they're creating golden calves. And we have to live faithfully in the ordinary and at the bottom of the mountain too.
Yeah, and maybe that's where revival begins, the root of it. And if we as a church can learn or can continue to learn to live this way, to make worship not just about something we attend, but something we embody, then maybe we'll start to see what the early church saw, or continue to see. Lives changed, needs met, hearts awakened.
Yeah, and I think that's our prayer, that we would not settle for just mountaintop experiences like what happens at Sinai or the transfiguration of Jesus, all of these things that are literally happening on mountaintops, but that we could live the kind of life that happens in the valley, where in the ordinary, on the Mondays and the Tuesdays, not the Sundays, we learn to live faithful lives in the mundane and the ordinary. And I think that maybe that is the most sacred thing that we could be a part of.
Thank you for being with us today. We will continue this next week, and we hope that you listen. We hope that if this encouraged you or inspired you, that you might share this. We're grateful for you and your faithfulness to this congregation and this church.